This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're exploring rules and regulations intended to protect the environment here in the Empire State. And to help us make sense of this changing landscape, we're joined remotely by Julie Tighe, president of the New York League of Conservation Voters, who in another life was the top staffer at the State Department of Environmental Conservation. Welcome back to the show, Julie.
Glad to be here. Sorry I'm not there in person. The blizzard, ironically, is keeping me in New York City.
It's all right. I appreciate the pivot to the Zoom conversation. And I want to start with the Trump administration's decision in February to basically roll back the federal government's authority to address pollution that contributes to climate change. Does this have any immediate impact on state rules and regulations in New York, or are our standards not tied to federal standards that combat climate change?
We have a lot of laws in here in New York that allow the State Department of Environmental Conservation and NYSERDA and others to make sure that we're continuing to advance policy. But it's bad because other states that don't have such laws or entities that are really, more permitted by the federal government may not have to comply with those any longer. And that's going to mean, less limits on pollution from cars, which we can't regulate other than what California does, on power plants and on industry. And when that happens, that means we're going to have more asthma, more heart and lung disease, higher medical bills, and people are ultimately going to pay more at the pump as we're dealing with, lower fuel economy standards, which doesn't really make any sense whatsoever, right? It's not good for people. It's not good for their health. Really, all it is Donald Trump and Lee Zeldin giving a free pass to polluters at the expense of our communities.
So we think of New York as a relatively aggressive state when it comes to environmental protections, but are there any areas where we might have relied on federal standards? You mentioned the issue of the transportation sector, but are there any areas that traditionally we've deferred to the federal government and thus we'll now need to step in, or does that network of rules and regulations that we might already have ensure that this doesn't have such a demonstrable effect within our own borders?
Sure. I think that Commissioner Lefton could answer that more adroitly, but certainly for the most part, we've not been relying on the federal government, right? We have laws that we implement the Clean Air Act here in New York, we implement the Clean Water Act, and it is clear that they are no longer interested in protecting the environment at the Environmental Protection Agency or the people who are benefiting from that. The biggest thing that we don't have control over is for cars and trucks. That there's always been sort of New York follows the California cars. That's in contention right now. California has a waiver, and states can follow that, or they follow EPA's rules as far as fuel economy standards go. And that's bad for, Americans. And frankly, it's bad for American car manufacturers because the rest of the world is going with more efficient, moving towards electric vehicles at a much faster pace than we are here in America with these rollbacks from the federal government. But more importantly, it's like we have to make sure that we are not just letting profits be maximized by oil and gas and coal companies. We really need to be making sure that we're protecting public health and providing cleaner air and water because that's what everybody wants. And those are not partisan issues. I'd like to remind everybody that the Environmental Protection Agency was established by Richard Nixon. And that's when, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts were adopted because people don't want to go back to those days where you could, physically see the air, right? We saw an example of that when we had those forest fires and the sky was orange. It used to be that way from pollution, from industry, and certainly we don't want to go back in that way. So I believe that, DEC has a lot of authority to act and are there risks? Absolutely. Will there be lawsuits on multiple sides? I feel guaranteed that that will happen. But certainly, the endangerment finding itself, which is what was repealed recently, was based on science and it was based on legal foundations that really was meant to safeguard our health, our climate, and the economy. So it makes no sense whatsoever for us to be moving backwards, protecting this, rule that provides clean air.
Well, as I mentioned at the top, in another life, you were a top DEC staffer. So, do you envision or imagine that there are efforts at the state level to try to come up with creative solutions akin to what California did to get its Clean Air Act waiver back in 2024?
Well, the state has been supporting the work that California does on that. That's been going back a long
Sure.
time. It's actually built into the law because California's regulations of cars predated the Clean Air Act, right? So that's sort of a unique circumstance on that front. But certainly, I think the state has been doing all that it can, and the Attorney General and the governor have been supportive of all the litigation to try and help stop these rollbacks because we're also talking about an administration that now says they're only going to take into consideration the impacts on polluters and the costs for them when they're evaluating rules and compliance, as opposed to the cost to people, right, in terms of health. And to me, that is a real backward finding. And that's something that the state of New York will continue to do and is required, I think, under the State Administrative Procedure Act. So certainly, this is something that we need the state to keep standing up and fighting because there's no reason for us to be rolling back and making the health of our people worse at the for the benefit of corporate polluters.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you for listeners just joining us. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Julie Tighe, president of the New York League of Conservation Voters. So I want to turn to this issue that is ongoing in New York, and that is rules and regulations being written by the State Department of Environmental Conservation in response to a law that was adopted a few years ago to basically expand the footprint of wetlands that are protected in New York. And we have heard now from lawmakers who've raised concerns that the rules and regulations are overly burdensome when it comes to efforts to do different developments. And here in New York, the governor is promoting the development of, say, new housing and has also proposed, say, changing the way we do our traditional environmental quality review process. So, when you think about what the department is doing with regards to its rules and regulations of wetlands, do you feel like they're striking the right balance and looking to successfully navigate those potentially competing interests of developments like new housing and the preservation of wetlands?
Look, let's start with why do we want to protect wetlands in the first place, right? Right. Wetlands are like nature's sponge, right? People are always concerned about flooding and what happens with flooding. Well, wetlands act to absorb that water and make sure that it's protecting our communities and our structures, which is why the sort of the ecosystem benefits that they provide with that. They help us protect and filter drinking water and they provide protection, important habitats for vulnerable species, right? So we had on the rules until a few years ago that DEC really only protected wetlands that were 12.4 acres or larger. That left a lot of really important wetlands unprotected. We worked with a lot of partners in the conservation movement to try and advance greater protections because we were seeing the degradation of these wetlands. We know that if you put housing in land that had been a wetland, homeowners are going to have to deal with flooding in their basements, and they're going to wonder why, right? And it's no different, right? If we're talking about a farmland that used to be farmland, it reverts to wetland when it's left to its own devices. So, look, people who put houses in places that formerly were wetlands are setting up homeowners in the future to have basement flooding, right? There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So we have to make sure that we're putting buildings in places that are smart, because otherwise they're going to have this flooding that's just going to cause headaches for homeowners in the future. So that's not the point of wetlands regulation is not to make things more difficult for building, right? There's a lot of land. Yes, we're adding about 1 million acres of protected wetlands, right? But there's still a lot of other land that you can build housing on that's not that, including a lot of land that's previously been developed, right? And that's something that we strongly support. using previously developed land as a place for building new housing, and places in particular that are close to transit, I think are important and smart for climate, right? Because walkable communities, communities that are close to transit-oriented development are super important for that. But if we're building them in wetlands, you're just setting them up to have heartache later and needing sump pumps for the rest of their lives, as opposed to finding areas that don't have that. Are there ways that the rules can be implemented a little bit smarter? I think probably. I think that's always hard. It's been an update for, the first time in quite a while to those rules. We're talking to some folks about potential mitigation opportunities that would be both beneficial for our communities and for protecting the environment and wetlands in a way that's smarter. And I think that's something that we'll be, talking about more in the future.
Well, clearly, no one wants to build on a piece of property that's going to flood over and over again. But is, I guess, there reason to believe that the additional land that is now being covered is all a threat for flooding or is maybe not ripe for development? I guess that's what some people might argue is that it's an overly broad maybe definition of wetlands. Is there any reason to believe that we've just hit the right balance here and that we are only carving out those wetlands that would be problematic for future development?
Look, I think there's different impacts on different types of infrastructure when you're talking about building in a wetland, right? And we need those lands to do their work because the water is going to go somewhere, right? So if you think something is like it's a small wetland that doesn't have a lot of impact, that water is going to move somewhere. I always used to say when I was at DEC, water always wins, right? It goes where it's going to go, and if you put something in its place, it's going to move around it and go somewhere else, right? And so I do think there is a need to make sure that we are protecting wetlands. And I think there is been a balance of trying to look at how can we do this in a way that's smart. Nobody likes it when you're changing how they have to do business. And I think that there's probably some ways that could be a little bit smarter in how we're like protecting wetlands and doing mitigation because there's not no development in any wetlands ever. It's what do you have to do to mitigate that? And are you choosing areas like smartly where you can avoid impacts to wetlands while still, providing the development that you need? And there's always going to be a balance on that. Any restriction, right, is going to result in someone being unhappy. Like, let's be serious. Like, builders are like, you want to build everywhere, right? But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. People need nature for their own like mental health and access to open space. And wetlands provide, again, critical services. They are filtering our drinking water, they're protecting our communities from being flooded. And when you build in those areas that are wetlands, you're just going to result in, at some point in time, either the homes you're putting there or the adjacent homes getting flooded.
So, as you pointed out, we are dramatically expanding the map of protected wetlands in New York, which then creates an expanded map for something like illegal dumping. And I'm curious what you think about the capacity of the state environmental regulators or maybe even local officials to, say, monitor or keep an eye on illegal dumping in these protected areas.
I feel like this is a false choice
Okay.
here, right? Of course, like people who are going to do illegal things are going to do illegal things, right?
Well, I guess my
And
question then is, are we opening up the possibility for more area that we need to keep an eye on? For example, is an area that maybe wasn't protected previously and now comes under these protections, are there different rules for what can be left there, for example? And if so, if we're expanding that footage, do we need more eyes on the prize?
well, there's always a need for more staff at DEC to do enforcement. And I think they've been actually very creative and leaders on the use of drones, for example, and trying to look at environmental spills, just as a for instance, as a way for them to have more eyes and ears on the ground to try and help and using technology to help with that. And again, I think that most people are not seeking to do things illegally. There are a few people who are bad actors, and of course, they're going to they're going to do what they're going to do, and the state of New York is going to use their law enforcement officers to help stop that. And you've seen that, on Long Island. You've seen that in the Hudson Valley. I have a funny Mark Molinaro story about illegal dumping in the Hudson Valley that happened like we were meeting on the day that Elliot Spitzer went down. And so I think there's always going to be bad actors, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be providing additional protections for wetlands that provide these important services. I'm just going to say over and over again, when you build something, when you plan on building housing, as example, in a wetland, it's going to get wet. The word, it's right there in front of you, wetland, right? And so we're asking for something to do something different than it's going to be, and that's unreasonable. So it's really trying to make sure that how are we protecting the wetlands that need the most protection, and making sure that we're providing, good habitat connectivity, and how are we, providing the services that they provide to our communities, which again is in flood protection and drinking water filtration. I think those are two really important things that wetlands provide, and that we undervalue as society. And I think that the law change recognized that. And so, yes, DEC has to be smart in how they implement it, but certainly we need to protect these additional wetlands. Just because we weren't protecting them before doesn't mean they weren't worthy of being protected, nor available and useful to providing, services to our communities.
Well, we've been speaking with Julie Tighe. She's the president of the New York League of Conservation Voters. Julie, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on this very snowy day.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.